Please, pretend you know me. 5 minutes, that is all. It was 10:50 on a Wednesday night in late October, on the marble concourse of a Gangnam office tower, when Ngozi looked up from the mop bucket she had been pushing along the service corridor and found a woman in a torn silk blazer gripping her wrist. The woman smelled of rain and expensive perfume gone stale with fear, and behind the revolving doors 2 men in dark coats stood checking their watches like men who were paid by the hour to be patient. Ngozi had cleaned this lobby for 14 months without a single resident ever learning her name. Everyone in that building had long since decided a cleaner in a gray uniform was furniture that moved. She expected to shake her head, finish her shift, and take the last subway back to Selim before the train stopped running at midnight. A sensible woman protecting a sponsored visa she could not afford to lose. What she did instead, put her mop against the wall, took the stranger's arm, and walked her past security like they had known each other for years. The mop bucket stayed exactly where she had left it, wheels crooked against the baseboard, and nobody in that lobby would remember later that it sat there for 11 minutes while the elevator carried 2 women to the 9th floor. Security had a name for the corridor Ngozi was supposed to use. Service stairs only, the laminated sign said, taped at eye level since before she started, and she had never once ridden the resident elevator in 14 months of shifts. She expected, if anyone asked, to say the woman had fainted and she was only helping her sit down. She did not expect the elevator doors to open on 9 and reveal a man in a charcoal suit already standing there, phone still lit in his hand, waiting for an elevator he had not called. He did not ask who Ngozi was. He looked at the woman's shaking hands, then at the uniform, then said nothing at all, and held the doors open 11 floors longer than any elevator needed to be held, while somewhere below, unseen by either of them, a security guard was already reviewing the lobby footage and reaching for his radio. By the time Ngozi reached the 9th floor waiting room, the woman in the torn blazer had stopped shaking enough to give a name, and it was not a name Ngozi recognized, though the receptionist behind the desk went pale at the sound of it and reached for a phone with visibly unsteady fingers. Ngozi did not ask questions. She had learned in 3 different countries that questions from a cleaner were rarely welcomed, and she had a bucket abandoned 9 floors below and a shift report due at midnight. She settled the woman into a chair, found water in a cooler behind the reception desk without being told where it was, and stood back the way she always stood back, near the wall, present but unclaimed. The man in the charcoal suit had not moved from where the elevator left him. He watched Ngozi do all of it, the water, the steady voice, the refusal to hover or perform concern for an audience, and something in his face shifted, so briefly that the receptionist did not catch it, and Ngozi, focused on the trembling woman, did not either. He turned and walked toward a door marked with no name at all, and the door closed behind him without a sound. Ngozi went back for her bucket. That was the part nobody in that building would have predicted. Not the water, not the elevator, but the fact that she returned to the 9th floor a second time 20 minutes later, this time by the service stairs as the sign demanded, to check that the woman had somewhere to go and someone to call. She found the waiting room empty, the woman gone, no note, no name, nothing but a business card left face down on the seat cushion, and when she turned it over, the only word printed on it was a single surname she now recognized from the gold lettering across the building's own entrance 3 floors below her feet. Her supervisor found her 40 minutes later still holding the card and told her, in the flat voice reserved for cleaners who had overstepped, that Mr. Han did not meet with staff and she should not have gone anywhere near the 9th floor, elevator or no elevator, tonight or any night again. Ngozi said nothing, put the card in her pocket instead of the trash, and finished her shift wondering whether she had helped a stranger or made herself impossible to ignore in a building built entirely on being ignored. Ngozi Adeyemi had come to Seoul 3 years earlier on a language school visa that had since curdled into something more precarious, a work permit tied to a cleaning contractor who paid 2 weeks late as a matter of policy and treated every renewal as a favor rather than a right. She had trained as a nurse in Lagos, had 2 years of hospital work behind her that counted for nothing here without a Korean license she could not yet afford to sit for, and she sent home enough each month that her mother had stopped asking when she was coming back. The building she cleaned belonged to Hanchang Group, 11 floors of glass and old family money in the middle of Gangnam, and in 14 months she had learned its rhythms the way she had once learned hospital wards, which lights stayed on past midnight, which offices smelled of good coffee, and which of stale ambition, which security guard let her take her 10-minute break sitting down. She had never learned a single resident's name because residents did not offer them, and she had stopped expecting to be offered anything at all. The card sat in the front pocket of her uniform for 4 days before she worked up the nerve to look up the surname properly, and when she did, on a library computer during her 1 weekly free hour, the search returned a man photographed at a shipping conference, a hospital opening, a funeral. Han Jae-won, Chief Executive Officer, Hanchang Group, widower. 1 daughter, age 7, rarely photographed. She closed the browser tab so fast her hand shook, because a man like that did not ride his own elevator to the 9th floor to hold a door for a cleaner, and yet she had watched him do exactly that, and she had spent 4 days telling herself it meant nothing while checking, every night before sleep, that the card was still in her bag. Her roommate Blessing, a nursing assistant from Enugu who worked nights at a clinic in Silim, told her to throw it away before it got her fired, and Ngozi agreed out loud and did not throw it away. She told herself the reason was practical. A Chable executive's private line was worth keeping in case the injured woman ever needed a witness. But the truth sat closer to something she did not want to name, a small, persistent curiosity about a man who had said nothing and somehow said the only thing that mattered. On the 5th day, her supervisor called her into the basement office and told her, without preamble, that head office wanted to see her upstairs, and Ngozi's first thought was not opportunity. It was the sign on the service stairwell door, the one that had governed her movements for 14 months, and the certainty that she was about to be told, formally this time, exactly where she belonged. The basement office where cleaning staff were summoned for discipline had a particular smell of bleach and burnt coffee that Ngozi associated with every reprimand she had received in 14 months, and she walked in expecting a version of the same conversation, a warning about the elevator, a note in her file, perhaps the loss of the overtime shifts she depended on to make her rent. Instead, her supervisor, a woman named Choi who had never once used Ngozi's first name, would not meet her eyes and said only that a car was waiting outside the loading dock and that Ngozi was to go with the driver immediately, still in uniform. No explanation offered, because none had been offered to Choi either. The car was black and silent and smelled of leather that had never been touched by anything as ordinary as spilled coffee, and the driver did not speak to her the entire ride, which took them not to the tower she cleaned but to a private clinic in a wealthier district, where a nurse in a crisp uniform led her to a small waiting room and asked her to sit. Ngozi's stomach had folded into a hard knot by the time the door opened, and the woman from the lobby, no longer trembling, dressed now in something simple and expensive, hair pulled back to reveal a fading bruise along her jaw that had been carefully covered before but was now deliberately shown, walked in and sat across from her without asking permission. Her name, she said, was Han So-young, and she was Jae-won's younger sister, and the men outside the tower that night had been sent by her husband's family, a marriage arranged 2 years earlier that had gone from cold to dangerous in ways her brother had not known until that night. She said thank you the way people say it when the words are inadequate and they know it, and then she said the thing Ngozi had not prepared for at all, that her brother wanted to meet the woman who had not asked a single question before deciding to help. Ngozi's first instinct was refusal, quiet and immediate, the same instinct that had kept her safe through 3 years of a foreign country's small daily humiliations. Powerful families did not summon people like her for gratitude, they summoned them for silence, for a signature on something, for reassurance that no story would ever be told. She said she needed to get back to her shift. So-young smiled for the first time since walking in, and said her brother had already told the contractor Ngozi would not be working tonight, and that he was waiting 2 floors up. Han Jae-won's office 2 floors up was smaller than Ngozi expected, no wall of windows performing wealth, no wide desk meant to put visitors at a disadvantage, just a room with good light and a low table where he stood, rather than sat when she came in, which she noticed and filed away as strange before she understood why it mattered. He thanked her plainly, without the theater she had braced for, and told her that his sister's marriage had been arranged by their father 2 years earlier to secure a shipping contract, that he had suspected the husband's temper for months without proof, and that Ngozi's decision not to hesitate on the marble floor of his own lobby had likely kept his sister out of a car she would not have walked away from. He said this looking at a point somewhere past Ngozi's shoulder, the way men spoke when a feeling was inconvenient to show directly, and then he asked what he could do, and Ngozi understood this was the moment the story was supposed to turn into an envelope of cash and a request that she never speak of the tower again. She said she wanted nothing, which was not entirely true. She wanted her contractor to stop docking her pay for late trains. She wanted 8 hours of sleep. She wanted the nursing license exam fee she had been saving toward for 2 years. But none of that felt like a thing you asked a stranger for, even a stranger who owned the building you scrubbed floors in. Jaewon studied her for a long moment, the kind of silence that in her experience from powerful men usually preceded either dismissal or a demand, and instead he asked, almost carefully, whether she had children, whether she had family here, whether the uniform she was still wearing was the only work she had. She answered honestly because lying to him seemed both pointless and somehow beneath what the last hour had cost her, and when she mentioned, only to explain her tiredness, that her daughter back home, her sister's daughter really, whom she had half-raised before leaving, was the reason she sent money every month, something crossed his face that had nothing to do with business at all. He said he had a daughter too, 7 years old. He did not explain further, and the silence that followed felt larger than the room could hold. What Jaewon offered instead of money was smaller and stranger, and took Ngozi 3 days to say yes to, a position, 3 afternoons a week, watching his daughter Hana after school, until the housekeeper's shift began at 7, because the last 2 nannies had quit within a month, and Hana had stopped speaking to strangers almost entirely since her mother died the previous winter. It paid less than Ngozi's cleaning overtime and came with no visa sponsorship, no promise, nothing but 3 afternoons in a penthouse she had once mopped the lobby beneath, and every instinct she had built over 3 hard years told her to say no to a rich man's convenient solution dressed up as an opportunity. She almost did. She sat in her one-room apartment with Blessing across the small table between their beds and listed every reason it was a trap: the class distance, the danger of being useful to a man that powerful and then discarded, the fact that grief-stricken 7-year-olds were not a job description she was qualified for any more than nursing licenses she didn't yet hold. Blessing, practical as always, pointed out that the hours left her mornings free for cleaning shifts and her evenings free for the study course she'd been postponing for 2 years, and that no one in Seoul had ever offered Ngozi anything without a catch attached, so perhaps the absence of an obvious catch here was worth testing rather than refusing outright. Ngozi called the number on the card on the 4th day, expecting to negotiate, and instead reached a scheduling assistant who simply told her Wednesday at 3 would work well, as though her yes had never been in question. She showed up in her one good blouse instead of her uniform, stood outside the penthouse door for 4 full minutes before knocking, and when it opened, a small girl in a school cardigan looked up at her with an expression Ngozi recognized instantly, because she had worn it herself at that age in a different country, after a different loss, the flat, careful blankness of a child who had learned that trusting new adults rarely paid off. The first afternoon went badly, in the ordinary way these things go badly, which is to say, Hana said almost nothing, ate half of the snack the housekeeper had left out, and retreated to her room the moment homework was finished, leaving Ngozi standing in a kitchen larger than her entire apartment, wondering if she had made a mistake, accepting a job built on a grieving child's silence. She did not push. She had learned, from raising her sister's daughter through the year after their mother's stroke, that children carrying grief could smell an adult's need to fix things the way dogs smelled fear, and that the surest way to be shut out entirely was to arrive with an agenda. So on the second afternoon, she brought nothing but a small tin of chin-chin she had fried the night before, homesick and restless, and left it on the kitchen counter without comment, and ate her own portion slowly at the table while Hana did homework 12 feet away pretending not to watch. By the 3rd week, Hana had started asking, without quite looking up from her workbook, what the fried snack was called, and whether Ngozi's country had a word for the rain that fell in the afternoons there, and Ngozi found herself describing Lagos in the wet season, the sound of it on zinc roofs, in a kitchen on the 9th floor of a Gangnam tower, while a chef stove sat unused behind her, because Hana preferred the smaller portable one Ngozi used to fry things the old way. Jaewon came home early one Wednesday in November, something he almost never did, and stood in the hallway for nearly a minute before either of them noticed him, watching his daughter laugh. Actually laugh. A sound he told Ngozi later he had not heard in the apartment since the funeral, over a mispronounced Korean word Ngozi had gotten wrong on purpose to make her correct it. He did not interrupt. He set his bag down quietly and waited until the moment passed on its own before announcing himself, and when Ngozi caught his eye across the kitchen, something passed between them that neither one commented on, an acknowledgement too fragile to survive being spoken aloud. That night, after Ngozi had left, Hana asked her father, unprompted, whether Ngozi could come on Saturdays too, and Jaewon found himself saying he would ask, surprised at how quickly the answer had formed in his own chest before he had examined why. The Saturdays became a fixture before anyone formally agreed to them, the way arrangements between people who like each other tend to solidify without paperwork, and by January Ngozi had reduced her cleaning shifts to weekday mornings only, trading income security for something she could not yet name but recognized as more sustainable for her body, and, though she would not have admitted it easily, for her spirit. Jaewon began appearing for the last 20 minutes of these afternoons more often than his schedule strictly required, ostensibly to relieve Ngozi so she could catch an earlier train, though the 20 minutes routinely stretched to an hour of the three of them at the kitchen table, Hana narrating her school day with an animation that the housekeeper told Ngozi, privately and with some wonder, had not existed before autumn. He was, Ngozi came to notice, a man who listened with his whole attention, an unusual quality in someone who ran a company of 11,000 employees, and he asked about Nigeria not as a curiosity, but as a place he was trying to understand, because his daughter had started asking about it too. He learned to say a few words of Igbo badly, at Hana's insistence, and endured being laughed at by both of them without visible embarrassment, which surprised Ngozi more than anything else about him. She had expected a Chable heir's pride to be brittle, and instead found it strangely absent in his own kitchen, present only, she noticed, in boardroom photographs, and the careful blankness he wore whenever cameras appeared. One Saturday in February he asked, almost sideways, whether she had ever considered the nursing license exam seriously, and when she admitted the fee had been just out of reach for 2 years running, he said nothing further that day, but the following week an envelope appeared on the kitchen counter with the exam registration confirmation already paid, and her name already filled in, no note attached. Ngozi stared at it for a long time. She had spent 3 years bracing against exactly this kind of gesture from exactly this kind of man, the wealthy solving inconvenient gratitude with a check, and yet this did not feel like that. It felt like he had listened to an offhand sentence in November and remembered it in February, which frightened her more than money ever could, because money she knew how to refuse. She confronted him about it the following Saturday, waiting until Hana had gone to shower before setting the envelope, unopened, on the table between them, and telling him plainly that she could not accept it, that she had come to this apartment to care for his daughter, and not to be managed like a problem with a price tag. Jaewon did not apologize the way she expected, did not retreat into the smooth deflection of a man used to buying his way out of discomfort. He said, instead, that he had watched her turn down a company car, turn down a raise his assistant had drafted without being asked, turn down an offer to move her cleaning contract entirely under Han Chang's more generous terms, and that he had run out of ways to say thank you that she would allow herself to receive. He said the exam fee was not payment for anything. It was the only thing he could think of that gave her something without asking her to be grateful for it, since a license was hers to keep regardless of what happened between his family and her afterward. Ngozi sat with that for a long moment, turning the envelope over once, and told him, because she had decided, weeks earlier, that surviving in his daughter's life required more honesty than politeness usually allowed, that she needed him to understand something about where she came from. In Lagos, she said, women in her family did not accept gifts from powerful men without the whole street deciding what kind of woman she must be. And here in Seoul the calculation was different, but the cost was the same. The moment money moved between them, whatever this was became a transaction that erased everything true about her showing up in his kitchen 3 afternoons a week for a grieving child, not for him. Jaewon listened without interrupting, which she had already learned was rare and deliberate in him, and when she finished he pushed the envelope back toward her and said only that he understood, and that he would ask before deciding anything for her again, and that this was, in his experience, the first time anyone in his adult life had refused something from him and made him feel respected rather than resisted. Ngozi took the envelope home that night anyway, unopened, uncertain whether accepting it later would mean she had lost the argument or won something neither of them had named yet. Word travels through a company the way water finds cracks in concrete, quietly and then all at once. And by early March, the fact that Han Jaewon's daughter had a Nigerian nanny who ate lunch with the CEO on Saturdays had become the kind of detail that traveled from the executive floor to the mailroom without ever being confirmed by anyone in a position to confirm it. Ngozi first felt the shift in the lobby she still occasionally passed through, in the way the day-shift security guard who used to nod at her now looked past her shoulder, and in the pointed silence of two junior executives who stopped talking when she stepped into the elevator she was, technically now, permitted to use. She said nothing to Jaewon about it, partly from pride and partly from a clear-eyed understanding that his intervention would only confirm whatever story was already forming about her. But So-young noticed on a visit in mid-March, catching the tail end of a whispered exchange between two assistants near the coffee station, and told Ngozi bluntly over tea afterward that the whispering was not really about her at all. It was about their father. Han Jae-won's father, chairman emeritus and still the loudest voice in every family decision, despite having formally retired 2 years earlier, had built Han Chang's reputation on a very specific idea of what belonged at the family's table, and a foreign cleaner, spending unsupervised afternoons in his grandchild's home, was, So-young said carefully, exactly the kind of detail that would eventually reach him whether anyone intended it to or not. Ngozi asked what that meant in practice. So-young's answer was gentler than the question deserved, but no less honest for it. It meant that if this arrangement was ever going to become something more than convenient afternoons, someone was going to have to survive a conversation with their father, and their father did not lose conversations. Ngozi went home that night and sat for a long time with Blessing's old warning replaying in her head, the one about no one in Seoul offering anything without a catch, and wondered whether the catch had simply been slower to arrive than she expected, waiting instead for her to become attached enough that its cost would actually hurt. The summons, when it came, arrived not as an invitation but as an instruction relayed through Jaewon's assistant, requesting Ngozi's presence at the family's countryside residence outside Seoul the following Sunday, ostensibly to discuss what the message called Hana's care arrangements going forward. Jaewon offered to drive her himself and to sit beside her through whatever his father intended to say, and Ngozi refused both offers, telling him that whatever test this was, she needed to face it as herself, and not as someone arriving already under his protection, because his father would see the difference immediately, and it would cost her more in the long run than any discomfort saved in the short one. She wore, in the end, not her one good blouse but a wrapper and blouse her mother had sewn for her before she left Lagos, a decision that took her 20 minutes of second-guessing in front of the mirror in her tiny apartment before she understood that dressing as someone she wasn't would be its own kind of surrender. The residence sat behind a stone wall on a hillside 40 minutes outside the city, a house built in the traditional style with modern additions tucked carefully out of sight, and the chairman received her not in a warm room but in a formal one, seated already when she entered, a single chair positioned across from him with no one else present, Jaewon and So-young both conspicuously excluded from a conversation that was clearly meant to happen without witnesses. He did not offer tea. He asked, without preamble, what exactly Ngozi believed she was doing in his granddaughter's life, and whether she understood that Han Chang's reputation had survived 70 years of careful marriages and careful appearances, and that his son's grief, however real, was not sufficient justification for decisions that would follow the family for a generation. Ngozi had rehearsed nothing, because she had learned that rehearsed answers cracked under real pressure, and so she told him the truth as plainly as she had told his son the truth about the envelope, that she had taken the position to help a child who would not speak to strangers, that she had never once asked for anything beyond her wage, until he insisted she take an exam fee she'd since decided to accept on her own terms, and that if his real question was whether she intended to marry her way into his family's money, he was welcome to check her bank statements, because 3 years of remittances to Lagos told a far less interesting story than the one apparently circulating among his staff. The chairman did not soften at her answer, but something in his posture recalibrated, the way men accustomed to being feared sometimes recalibrate when they encounter someone who is simply not afraid in the way they expect. He asked how she had come to Seoul, and she told him, the language program, the nursing training that Korea did not yet recognize, the sister's daughter she had half-raised in Lagos before leaving to earn enough to secure the child's schooling. He asked about her family's standing, a question so bluntly classist that under different circumstances, Ngozi might have simply stood and left, and instead she answered it because she understood, watching his face, that he was not really asking about money at all, but about whether she came from people who had taught her to want things that weren't hers. Her father, she said, had been a school teacher for 31 years in a town outside Lagos, respected by everyone who had ever sat in his classroom and buried with more mourners than the church could hold, and her mother still ran a small tailoring business from the front room of their house, and neither of them had raised a daughter who needed a rich man's name to know her own worth. The chairman was quiet for a long moment after that, long enough that Ngozi began to wonder if she had gone too far, and then he said, in a voice stripped of its earlier edge, that his own mother had been a seamstress in Busan before the war made her a refugee twice over, and that he had spent 60 years making sure no one who worked for Han Chang would ever have to know that kind of hunger again, even as he built walls around his family so high that his own son had grieved a wife alone for a year without anyone outside these walls learning of it. It was not an apology, it was not permission either. But he told her, rising to signal the meeting's end, that he would be watching how she conducted herself going forward, and that watching, for a man like him, was the only form of respect he currently had to offer, and Ngozi left the residence uncertain whether she had passed a test or merely survived its first round. Jaewon was waiting outside the gate when she emerged, having driven out separately against his father's explicit instruction and parked a discreet distance down the hillside road, and the sight of him leaning against his car in the fading light undid something in Ngozi that the chairman's questions had not managed to touch. She had held herself together through an interrogation designed to find her weak points, and it was the ordinary, unauthorized fact of him waiting that made her hands finally start shaking. He did not ask what had been said. He opened the passenger door, waited until she was seated, and drove in silence for nearly 10 minutes before she was ready to talk. And when she finally recounted the conversation, flatly and without embellishment, he pulled the car onto the shoulder of the road overlooking the reservoir and sat with both hands on the wheel, jaw tight, for a long moment before speaking. He said his father had done the same thing to his late wife, a less severe version of it, years earlier, testing her lineage and her intentions in a formal room with no one else present, and that his wife had told him about it only once, on their wedding night, and never again, as though the memory embarrassed her more than it should have. He said he was angry, not performatively, not for Ngozi's benefit, but in the quiet, controlled way she had learned was his only register for real feeling, that his father had made her sit through it at all, regardless of the outcome. Ngozi told him, gently but without softening it, that she had not needed rescuing from that room, that she had chosen to walk in and answer for herself precisely because she needed him to understand she was not someone who required protecting from consequences she'd accepted with open eyes. He looked at her for a long moment in the dim car, the reservoir dark and still beyond the windshield, and said that he understood, and that it was, he thought, the exact quality in her that had made him unable to stop thinking about a woman he'd watched hold open a stranger's trembling hands on his own marble floor 5 months earlier. Neither of them moved to close the distance between the two front seats. Both of them noticed the distance regardless. Spring arrived, and with it a rhythm that neither of them named out loud but both of them protected. Ngozi's afternoons with Hana, stretching by unspoken agreement into evenings that sometimes included Jaewon cooking badly and cheerfully, while his daughter narrated his mistakes with the confident cruelty of a 7-year-old food critic. Ngozi found herself, more than once, catching herself mid-laugh and wondering when exactly this apartment had started to feel like a place she belonged, rather than a place she was employed. The chairman's watching, as he had promised, continued in small and deliberate ways. A car sent unannounced to verify she arrived home safely after a late evening, a question relayed through So Young about whether Ngozi's exam preparation was going well. Gestures that felt less like surveillance now and more like a gruff, sideways kind of attention Ngozi had seen before in her own father's generation of men who did not know how to say, "I am paying attention because I care," without it sounding like an accusation. In April, she sat the nursing license exam and passed it on her first attempt, a fact she told no one at first except Blessing, wanting to hold the accomplishment privately before it became something Jaewon's family could claim credit for, and when she finally mentioned it, almost offhand, over the kitchen table, Hana shrieked with an unguarded joy that made both adults laugh, and Jaewon went uncharacteristically quiet, watching Ngozi across the table with an expression she was starting to recognize as the one he wore when words felt insufficient to him. He asked her, later that night at the door, so carefully it took her a moment to understand what he was actually asking beneath the words, whether she would consider the two of them being something other than careful around each other going forward. An admission delivered with none of the confidence she'd have expected from a man who ran a company of 11,000 people and all of the vulnerability of someone who had not said such a thing aloud since his wife died. Ngozi did not answer immediately. She told him she needed to know what it would cost her, not romantically, but practically, in visa terms and family terms, and the terms of a country that had made very clear, in 14 months of service stairs signs, exactly what it thought she was for. They did not announce anything, which in hindsight was itself a kind of announcement, because a man as visible as Han Jiawan appearing at his daughter's school events with a woman who was clearly no longer just staff produced its own gravity. And by early May, a tabloid photographer working a slow news week caught the two of them leaving a quiet restaurant in Itaewon, Jaewon's hand resting at the small of Ngozi's back in a gesture too familiar to be professional, and the photograph ran online within hours with a caption that used the word nanny like an accusation. The comment sections filled overnight with a particular flavor of cruelty Ngozi had braced for without ever quite believing she'd have to read it in real time. Speculation about gold digging, about visa marriages, about what a man of Jaewon's standing could possibly want with a woman who mopped floors, laced through with the specific racialized language she had spent 3 years in Korea learning to anticipate, and had hoped, foolishly, this particular chapter of her life might spare her. Han Chang's stock dipped a fraction of a percent on the news, enough for board members to notice, enough for two of them to request an emergency call with the chairman that Jaewon was not invited to. He came to Ngozi's apartment that evening for the first time ever, having never once visited the small building in Siloam in 6 months of whatever they had been building carefully between school pickups and Saturday lunches, and stood in her doorway looking, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely uncertain of his footing. He told her the board wanted a statement distancing the company from what they called a personnel matter, and that his father had called twice that afternoon without saying a single word about the article, which Jaewon said was somehow worse than shouting. Ngozi asked him, standing in the doorway of the apartment he had never seen, whether he was there to warn her the arrangement was ending or to ask what she wanted to do about it, and the question landed with more weight than either of them expected, because it was, underneath the specific crisis, the question that had been waiting since the elevator door first opened 11 floors up. He answered that he had not come to warn her of anything, that he had spent the drive over rehearsing exactly the kind of careful, deflecting statement the board wanted, and had thrown it out somewhere around the third red light because he realized he was more afraid of losing her than of losing a fraction of a stock price, and that the fear had clarified something he'd been circling for months without saying outright. He told her that his father, for all his silence that afternoon, had said one thing before hanging up the second call, a single sentence Jaewon repeated to her standing in her doorway, that Han men had a long history of marrying for the company's convenience and burying their real feelings under duty, and that watching his son nearly lose something honest to a photograph and a board memo would be, in the chairman's words, a grief he did not intend to survive twice. Ngozi absorbed this slowly, aware that the moment asked something specific of her that gratitude and affection alone could not answer. She told him plainly that she needed him to understand the difference between him choosing her because it was difficult and therefore proved something, and him choosing her because he actually wanted the particular, unglamorous, complicated shape of a life with her in it, the visa paperwork, the remittances to Lagos that would not stop, the fact that she intended to work as a nurse regardless of what his name could offer her, the fact that she would not become smaller or quieter to make his board comfortable. She said the article had not frightened her nearly as much as the possibility that he might decide, quietly and reasonably, that the cost of choosing her publicly was higher than the relationship was worth, and that she would rather know that now, standing in her own doorway, than discover it slowly over years of him managing her existence around his family's comfort. Jaewon listened to all of it without interrupting, the same stillness she'd first noticed in his office 8 months earlier. And when she finished, he said that he had already told the board he would not be issuing any statement distancing himself from anything, because there was nothing about her that needed distancing from, and that he intended to say so publicly himself within the week, on his own terms, before anyone else could shape the story for him. The week that followed tested the promise immediately, because promises made in a doorway at night are easier than promises kept in daylight in front of a board of directors who had built careers on managing exactly this kind of reputational risk. And on Thursday morning, Ngozi arrived for her regular afternoon with Hana to find So-young waiting for her in the lobby instead, her expression carefully arranged into something diplomatic that did not quite conceal the worry underneath it. So-young told her that 2 board members had gone over their father's head directly to legal counsel, questioning whether Jaewon's public statement, already drafted, already scheduled for release that afternoon, exposed the company to what they termed optics risk, during a delicate merger negotiation with a conservative partner firm in Osaka, and that their father, to everyone's surprise including his own children, had sat through the entire meeting saying almost nothing until the very end. What he'd said, when he finally spoke, So-young relayed carefully, watching Ngozi's face as she did, that Han Chang had survived 70 years by adapting to markets that changed faster than boardrooms like to admit, and that a partner firm too rigid to work with a modern company was a partner firm they could replace, but a son who had finally chosen to be honest instead of convenient was not something the company got a second chance to protect. It was not, So-young added quickly, an endorsement exactly. Their father had not suddenly become a sentimental man, but it was, functionally, a door held open, the same door Ngozi had watched Jaewon hold open with his own hand 8 months earlier on a night that had started with a stranger's trembling wrist. Ngozi sat with Hana that afternoon distracted and quiet, watching the girl draw a picture of what she called her family, 3 figures under a lopsided sun that included, without any prompting from anyone, a 4th figure with dark skin and braided hair, standing slightly apart from the others but unmistakably included, and Ngozi understood, looking at a 7-year-old's crayon drawing, exactly how much more than a title or a public statement was actually at stake that week. Jaewon's statement, when it came that evening, was shorter than anyone at Han Chang's communications office had wanted, and said less about the company than any of them were comfortable with, a handful of sentences released under his own name rather than the corporate account, confirming simply that he was in a relationship with Ngozi Adeyemi, a woman he respected, and that questions about her character or her motives could be directed to him rather than speculated about online. It did not mention her former employment. It did not offer the softening details, the nursing license, the schoolteacher father, the dead husband who had never existed to complicate the story further, that a cannier statement might have included to blunt the criticism, and Ngozi understood, reading it twice on her phone in the quiet of her apartment, that the omission was deliberate, that he had refused to make her legible to strangers in order to make her palatable. The backlash did not vanish. It thinned, though, in the specific way that public cruelty thins when the target refuses to look wounded by it, and within days a different kind of commentary began appearing alongside the ugly kind, women writing about watching a powerful man simply state a fact instead of apologizing for it, a small number of them naming, directly, the particular exhaustion of loving across the lines Korea drew so carefully around class and origin and skin. Ngozi's contractor called her the following Monday, unprompted, to inform her that her position had been quietly terminated effective immediately, citing a clause about conduct unbecoming that had never once been invoked in 14 months of scrubbing marble floors for residents who did not know her name. And Ngozi understood the timing was not a coincidence, understood that someone on that board or adjacent to it had found a smaller, meaner way to register their disapproval where the chairman's protection did not reach. She sat with the termination letter for a long time before calling Jaewon, not because she wanted him to fix it, but because she had promised herself months earlier that she would not let this relationship make her smaller, and telling him the truth of what it had already cost her felt like the opposite of smallness. Jaewon's first instinct on hearing about the termination was to offer her a position at Han Chang directly, and Ngozi's first instinct was to refuse it just as directly, because accepting a job from the man she was building a life with would hand every remaining critic exactly the narrative they wanted, proof that she had engineered her way from a mop bucket to a payroll through a relationship rather than through the license she had earned on her own in April. She told him this, standing in his kitchen, Hana asleep down the hall, and watched him absorb the refusal the way he had learned, over 8 months, to absorb her boundaries without treating them as obstacles to be managed around. What he offered instead, after a week of thinking it through rather than reacting, was smaller and more useful. An introduction, through a hospital administrator he knew socially rather than through the company, to a clinic in Silim actively hiring licensed nurses regardless of nationality, a lead she was free to pursue or ignore entirely on her own merit, with no guarantee attached and no favor implied beyond the introduction itself. She interviewed the following week using only her license and her hospital experience from Lagos, said nothing about Han Chang or Jaewon or any of it, and was offered the position on the strength of her qualifications alone, a fact that mattered to her more than anything a headline could have said about her worth. She started at the clinic in June, 3 weeks before the chairman, without warning or fanfare, invited her to Sunday dinner at the family residence for the first time, not as a subject of interrogation but as a guest, seated at the actual table this time, across from Jaewon rather than alone in a formal room. Hana between them, narrating the meal with her usual confident commentary, while the old man watched the three of them with an expression So-young later described, laughing, as the closest her father's face came to unguarded joy. He did not apologize that evening for the room with the single chair. He simply asked Ngozi, refilling her water without being asked, whether her mother back in Lagos still ran her tailoring business, and whether she thought the woman might ever consider visiting Seoul, a question so ordinary and so entirely unlike their first conversation that Ngozi understood it was the closest thing to an apology she was ever going to receive, and found, to her own surprise, that it was enough. Autumn brought a second photograph, though this one no one leaked and no tabloid published, taken instead by So-young on her phone at Hana's school festival in October. Jaewon crouched beside his daughter adjusting a paper crown for a class performance, while Ngozi stood a step behind them both, one hand resting lightly on Jaewon's shoulder in a gesture so unguarded that So-young sent it to the family group chat with no caption at all, because none was needed. Ngozi's mother did visit that autumn, 3 weeks in November, funded entirely by Ngozi's own clinic salary and the savings she had rebuilt since April, and the chairman insisted, over Ngozi's mild protest, on hosting a dinner for her at the residence, seating her not at the head of some hierarchy but simply beside him. Two people who had each buried a spouse and raised children through hardship, the other understood without needing it explained. Her mother told her afterward, in the small hours before her flight home, that she had expected to find her daughter changed by money or softened by comfort, and had instead found her sharper, steadier, more herself than she had been even before Lagos, a observation that meant more to Ngozi than anything Jaewon's family had ever said about her worth. The relationship was not by then uncomplicated. There were still board members who had not forgiven the merger delay in Osaka, still moments where Ngozi caught a stranger's eyes flicker with the old calculation before catching themselves, still nights when Jaewon worked too late and Ngozi worked doubles at the clinic, and they passed each other tired and distracted in a kitchen that had somehow, gradually, become both of theirs. But the shape of it had settled into something neither of them managed carefully anymore, something ordinary in the way real things eventually become ordinary, and on a Tuesday evening in late November, exactly 13 months after a mop bucket had sat abandoned against a lobby wall for 11 minutes, Jaewon came home from a trip to find Hana already asleep and Ngozi at the kitchen table reading a textbook for a specialization course she'd started that fall, and he stood in the doorway for a moment simply watching her, the way he had once watched her from a hallway holding open a door, before crossing the room to sit beside her without a word. The proposal, when it came the following spring, did not happen in the marble lobby or the countryside residence or anywhere the family's history might have staged it, but in the same convenience store, in a different neighborhood, where Ngozi had once eaten instant noodles alone on her breaks during her cleaning years. A detail Jaewon had remembered without her ever realizing he'd cataloged it, because she had mentioned once, in passing, that the smell of a particular brand always made her think of the loneliest stretch of her first year in Seoul. He had bought out the small store for 20 minutes on a Tuesday night, with the quiet, unshowy efficiency of a man who had learned exactly how to use his resources without ever making a display of them, and Hana, now 8 and fully in on the plan, sat at the counter pretending to work the register with theatrical seriousness, while her father knelt on the same tile floor where Ngozi had once eaten alone, holding not a diamond but a small tin, identical to the ones she used to fry chin-chin in on Saturday afternoons, inside which sat a ring she later learned had belonged to his grandmother, the seamstress from Busan, whose hunger the chairman had spent 60 years trying to outrun. Ngozi laughed before she cried, both hands over her mouth, remembering with sudden vivid clarity the exact texture of that first year's loneliness, the 11-hour shifts and the service stairs sign, and the particular ache of being invisible in a city of 10 million people, and understood, kneeling down to meet him at eye level rather than staying above him, that he had chosen this ordinary linoleum floor precisely because it was the opposite of the marble he had first watched her walk across with a stranger's shaking hand in hers. She said yes before he finished the question, which made Hana shriek with laughter and ruin the moment in exactly the way an 8-year-old should be allowed to ruin it. And outside the store's window, unnoticed by any of them, a security guard from a nearby building, off duty, curious about the commotion, watched a black Nigerian woman rise from a convenience store floor with a Korean man's ring on her hand, and thought, without any of the context that made it remarkable, that it looked like an ordinary kind of happiness, which was, Ngozi would later say, exactly the point. The wedding, the following autumn, was smaller than Han Chang's public relations department would have preferred, and larger than Ngozi's own family had ever hosted. Held not in a hotel ballroom but in the countryside residence's courtyard, strung with warm lights beneath a sky just cool enough to need the light shawl Ngozi's mother had sewn for the occasion, using fabric she'd carried from Lagos specifically for this. The chairman walked Ngozi partway down the aisle himself, an arrangement no one had requested and he had insisted on regardless, standing in for a father Ngozi had lost 11 years earlier, and if his eyes were wet when he handed her hand to his son, no one in the small gathered crowd was unkind enough to mention it aloud. Hana served at her own insistence as both flower girl and self-appointed wedding photographer, producing a phone full of blurry, off-center pictures that the family would treasure over the professional ones for years afterward, and Blessing flew in from her own visit home to stand beside Ngozi as the only witness who had known her during the mop bucket year, crying through the entire ceremony in a way she blamed loudly and unconvincingly on the wind. Near the end of the reception, after the formal toasts and the chairman's characteristically brief remarks, Jaewon found Ngozi standing near the courtyard's edge, looking out at the same hillside view where he had once pulled the car over, shaking with a feeling he hadn't yet had words for, and he handed her something small wrapped in plain paper, no ceremony to it at all, the original business card, the one she had carried in her uniform pocket for 4 days over a year earlier, which she had left in a coat pocket at some point and assumed lost, and which he had apparently recovered and kept without ever mentioning it. She turned it over in her hands, the same single surname printed in the same plain lettering, and understood that he had kept it not as a memento of his own power, but as a record of the exact moment before either of them knew what an elevator held open for 11 floors would eventually cost, and give, and become. She slipped it into the pocket of her wedding dress, next to nothing else, and walked back into the lights of the courtyard beside him, the door that had once said service stairs only standing, somewhere behind them both, permanently and quietly open.